The water keeps them. Location: Bitterroot Mountains, Montana, USA. Approximate year: 1998. In July of 1998, I went into the Bitterroot Mountains with an old man who claimed he could show me a lake that did not appear on any map. I never saw the lake. 6 days later, I came out of those mountains alone. For years, I told myself the old man had simply been a criminal, a hermit, maybe a lunatic who had spent too long away from people. That explanation worked for almost 20 years. Then, in 2017, I found his photograph in a Montana mining archive. The picture had been taken in 1904. He was decades younger in it, but there was no question in my mind. It was Elias Crowley. My name is Daniel Mercer. Back then, I was 31 and freelancing for a small outdoor magazine in Seattle, writing about fire lookouts, ghost towns, and old mining claims. I liked stories that were almost believable. That summer, I found 3 references to something called Crowley's Lake. The first was a 1911 newspaper clipping about 2 prospectors who disappeared west of the Bitterroot Valley. Their equipment was found beside a creek. They were not. The article said they had been searching for a remote lake where miners supposedly hid gold. The second reference came from a surveyor's diary written in 1926. He described meeting an old trapper who warned him away from an unnamed drainage. The trapper said, "Men go looking for Crowley's water when they want to get rich. The water keeps them instead." The third came from a retired Forest Service employee. He said the lake was somewhere near the Idaho line with no established trail and no place on official maps. That was enough for me. I arrived in Hamilton, Montana in the second week of July. The valley baked beneath summer haze and afternoon thunderheads. I spent 2 days asking questions. A bartender had heard the name. An older woman remembered her father mentioning it. An outdoor store clerk said people turned every unnamed pond into a legend eventually. Then I met Elias Crowley. I was eating breakfast in a diner when he sat 2 stools away. He was small, narrow through the shoulders, in faded canvas pants, old boots, and a pale long-sleeved shirt. His hair was almost white. His face looked somewhere between 70 and 90. He ordered black coffee, glanced at the Forest Service map beside my plate, and said, "You won't find it on there." What? The lake. I hadn't written Crowley's Lake anywhere on the map. What lake? The one you've been asking about. Hamilton wasn't big. I had been talking to people for 2 days. I told myself someone had mentioned me. Then he gave me his name, Elias Crowley. I laughed. He didn't. Was the lake named after your family? Something like that. He asked why I wanted to find it. I told him mining history, folklore, photographs, a magazine story. I never mentioned gold. He did. You're not the first man who came out here for that gold. I'm not looking for gold. No, you're looking for a story about men looking for gold. By the end of breakfast, he had offered to guide me there. I asked what he wanted. Company. He refused payment. 2 mornings later, someone dropped him at the trailhead. I never saw the driver. By 7, we were walking west through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The first day was beautiful. We crossed icy creeks, and by noon the forest smelled of pine resin, warm stone, and dust. Elias never seemed tired. I was 31 and fit. He looked at least 75, yet he kept the same pace uphill without breathing hard or asking to stop. That evening we camped beside a creek. I asked how long he had lived around the Bitterroots. Long enough. Then I asked about the gold. He said prospectors had worked those mountains around the turn of the century. One group disappeared. A second group went looking and vanished too. The lake, he said, sat in a bowl of dark rock above an old mining drainage. Some stories claimed sacks of gold had been thrown into the water. Others claimed the miners were still down there. Which version do you believe? Elias looked into the fire. Why does there have to be a difference? That night I woke because the forest had gone completely quiet. No insects, no creek, no wind. Elias stood beyond the firelight facing uphill. What are you doing? Listening? For what? Making sure we're alone. A minute later, the forest seemed to breathe again. The next morning, we left the established trail. From then on, I depended almost entirely on him. That afternoon, a thunderstorm hammered the canopy. 20 minutes later, sunlight returned and steam rose from the rocks. Elias stood in the rain without a jacket, looking upward like he had missed it. That night, I woke to sweet, bitter pipe smoke. Elias sat beside the dead fire with a tiny orange ember between his fingers. I had never seen tobacco among his things. On the third day, I noticed old cuts in several trees, 2 horizontal lines with a vertical mark beneath them. Survey marks? No. What are they? Directions. To the lake? He kept walking. By mid-afternoon, the forest changed. The trees grew older and farther apart. Brown needles swallowed our footsteps. Then I found a rusted food tin, broken glass, and the remains of a boot. Most of the leather was gone, but several brass eyelets were green with corrosion. I photographed everything. People leave too much behind, Elias said. That evening we found a ruined cabin, rotten logs sunk into moss, a collapsed chimney, and square nails. Near the foundation I uncovered a corroded metal plate. One word was readable: Crowley. I turned. Elias was standing directly behind me. You knew this was here? Yes. Was this your family's camp? My father's. Your grandfather's? My father. Elias, this cabin is more than 100 years old. More. When was your father here? 1901. And when were you born? 1882. I laughed once. He didn't. I stood, suddenly aware of how far we were from anybody. You wanted the story, he said. My bottle had been empty for almost an hour. I still thought the age story was some elaborate joke, and I was badly overheated. Elias held out his canteen. You look overheated. I hesitated, then drank. The water tasted normal. A minute later, the sweet smell of tobacco became overwhelming. The trees tilted. My knees gave out. The last thing I remember was Elias catching my shoulder. When I woke, my wrists were tied behind a cedar and my ankles were bound. My backpack, camera, boots, and belt were gone. Elias sat nearby, eating one of my energy bars. What did you give me? He ignored the question. You were too curious. I started shouting. He let me. No one comes this way anymore, he said. That was the point. What do you want? Nothing? Then untie me. No. Take the money. Take everything. I've got enough. Then he told me about the lake. His father had come into those mountains with 2 men in 1901. They found traces of gold and eventually reached the lake. After that, men kept coming with maps, rumors, and dreams of getting rich. His father learned that a man alone in the wilderness was easier to rob than a bank. Food, guns, cash, gold, equipment. What happened to them? They stayed. In the lake? Most? Then he told me he had killed his father in 1923. The old man forgot there only gets to be one owner. I told him that if he had been born in 1882, he was 116 years old. That's what the arithmetic says. You're insane. Probably. Then why bring me here at all? For the first time, he looked almost offended. I really was going to show it to you, Daniel. Then you started asking the right questions. I wish I had stopped there. Instead, I asked, "What's in the lake?" Something changed in his face. I don't know anymore. What does that mean? He looked toward the mountains. The water got deep. He stood and put on my pack. You're leaving me here? You said you wanted wilderness. He walked away. I shouted his name. He stopped once. You would have liked the lake. Then he disappeared between the trees. I stayed tied to that cedar until long after dark. A broken branch had grown into the trunk behind me. I worked the rope against its sharp end for hours until one hand finally came free. I had no boots, flashlight, food, map, or compass, so I followed water downhill. For the next 2 days, I followed the creek, drank from it, and ate huckleberries. By night, I shook beneath branches. The worst part wasn't being lost. It was the footsteps. Every few hours, I thought I heard someone behind me. Slow, unhurried. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. On the second night, I smelled that sweet pipe tobacco again. I ran barefoot through the dark until I fell into the creek. Nothing followed. On the third morning, I reached an old logging road. Late that afternoon, a Forest Service truck found me. I spent 4 days in the hospital with cut feet, infected wrists, and insect bites. The sheriff took my statement. Search teams found our first campsite and part of the drainage. After that, nothing matched what I remembered. No cabin, no marked trees, no Elias. Nobody in Hamilton knew an Elias Crowley. The diner waitress remembered an older man talking to me, but she couldn't describe his face clearly. Neither could I. I remembered white hair, gray eyes, and the bend in his shoulder, but not his nose, mouth, or ears. The sheriff decided I had been drugged, assaulted, and abandoned by a man using a false name. That explanation worked for 19 years. Then, in 2017, I found a digitized photograph labeled Crowley Prospecting Party, Bitterroot Range, 1904. 5 men. One of them was Elias. He looked decades younger, somewhere in his early 20s, but I recognized the narrow face, the eyes, and the slight bend in his left shoulder immediately. Seeing his face wasn't the same as remembering it. The photograph supplied details my mind still refused to. Under the photograph were 5 names. The last 2 were Thomas Crowley and Elias Crowley. The archive confirmed the glass plate existed. A historian found records showing Thomas and Elias had arrived around 1900. Both vanished from public records after 1923. No death certificates, no graves. There was one more document. A note attached to a 1914 mining survey described an unnamed lake nearby. The surveyor lowered 300 feet of line into it and never found the bottom. I have never gone back. But there is one last part. When search teams recovered my belongings in 1998, they were in a dry creek bed several miles from where, based on my memory of the route, I believed the ruins should have been. My backpack, my notebook, my boots, even my wallet. The camera was missing. 6 months later, a padded envelope arrived at the magazine office with no return address. Inside were strips of developed 35mm negatives and a set of prints. Most were mine. The trail, the creek, the cabin, Elias beside the fire. Then came 3 photographs I had never taken. One showed me unconscious beside the cedar. The second showed me tied to it. I gave the sheriff copies of the photograph showing Elias. They circulated it locally. Nobody recognized him, and no driver's license, property record, or voter registration existed under that name. The final frame was so underexposed, I thought it was blank. I took the negative to a lab and asked for the brightest usable print. There was water, black water, a mountain lake at night. The moon was reflected near the center. Just below it were pale shapes, dozens of them. I told myself they were rocks. On the far side of the photograph, Elias stood knee-deep in the lake, looking directly at the camera. And behind him, where the water should have reflected the mountains, there was no reflection at all. Only darkness. I burned that print. I wish I had burned the negatives, too. For years, I assumed the package was a threat. Now, I'm not so sure. Maybe Elias expected me to survive. Maybe he didn't want the story buried. Maybe he only wanted the road to the lake buried. Every few years, usually in July, I think about the question I asked Elias. What's in the lake? And his answer, I don't know anymore. Maybe the Crowleys really found gold, or maybe they found something else first. Something that let a man born in 1882 still be walking those mountains at the age of 116. Something that made keeping its location secret worth killing for. And I still remember the sentence from that surveyor's diary. Men go looking for Crowley's water when they want to get rich. The water keeps them instead. Maybe that wasn't a warning about greed. Maybe it was literal. This was the third story from the 6th collection. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds. To be continued.